Hello everyone, this is Mythion doing a Greenskins Unit guide for Total War Warhammer 2. The purpose of this is basically I kind of just want to go over every unit and sort of discuss what each unit's good for, kind of where it fits within an army comp, and this will be really useful for new players who are looking to play the Greenskins and are a bit overwhelmed with all the sort of, I would almost call it redundancy between some of the units. I mean, there's a lot of very similar units that serve a function, but just have like a couple of minor differences. Like, for example, Orc Boys versus Savage Orc Boys, or like Night Goblins versus Night Goblin Fanatics, those kinds of things. It's just like, well, how do I know which unit to use and which one's best? And I kind of want to just kind of explain that, kind of go over some of the nuances to really help push your mastery over the faction. This will help you in both campaign and multiplayer. Um, I kind of figured the style I want to do is just sort of make a tier list. First of all, tier lists are kind of fun, but also, just to sort of show the relative power that each unit has and just kind of give you a better visual as opposed to just, say, showing each unit on screen and then taking them away. That way you kind of get an overall sense of what's good and what's on the weak side. Granted, the thing about doing tier lists like this, it's not like other games where maybe things towards the bottom are like unusable. Like, for example, the Boar Boy Cav for this faction isn't particularly strong cavalry compared to a lot of other factions, so I'll put them towards the weak side, right? But it's still very important that you learn how to use them, and I'll talk about ways when we get to them and how you can actually have them win against, say, Empire Knights with the use of magic, maybe poison arrows, that kind of thing. So just because things are on the weak side doesn't necessarily mean that they're unplayable. In fact, with this game, everything can be usable if you strategize around it, which is kind of what makes the game pretty great in my opinion. But it's also that just knowing how good things are is just going to help you strategize that much better. So there's a lot of units. I'll try to be somewhat quick, but I want to make sure that each unit I explain well enough that you'll be able to be successful with it. And it's mostly going to apply to campaign, but some of these will transition to multiplayer as well. So, um, anyway, let's get into it. I guess I'll start with the initial Chaff Goblin unit, the Goblin Warriors. This is a unit that is pretty weak early on, right at the start of the campaign. It's essentially just your basic chaff, but it actually scales particularly hard because there is so much tech and skills in various lords that augment this that it actually can outstat like Orc Boys, for example, once everything's completely filled out. In addition to that, this is going to be a staple for your economy armies that are used to defend your territory in the late game. So oftentimes you'll have like 5 or 6 completely goblin armies that cost like 800 gold upkeep that can hold off AI doomstacks in the campaign. So I personally think Goblin Warriors are pretty phenomenal. They're obviously a staple in multiplayer because of just how efficient they are. It's worth noting too that it is 120 models that are getting buffed by your spells, that are getting buffed by WA. It's incredibly synergistic with the roster. And Silver Shields is a big deal. The fact that they're defensively skewed for holding lines is pretty insane. And I think they're honestly one of the more impressive units on the roster. Once you get your techs and stuff, obviously. It's kind of cool how they're like clearly weaker than Orc Boys. But later on in the campaign, they're actually both cheaper and stronger than Orc Boys. Just because there's more augmentation for them. Let's talk about Orc Boys. Pretty standard. This is what you're going to have Tier 1 at the start of the campaign. You're basically going to have like 5 to 7 of these guys in most of your early game armies. And compared to other infantry in the game, they essentially have more HP, more weapon strength, but worse combat stats. And that kind of evens out, but what ends up happening is over time, if you do multiple battles in a row without replenishing, you'll notice that these guys kind of get wear down just because they tend to get beaten up on. But there's a really good synergy with WA in particular because they have low melee attack but high weapon strength, right? When you WA, it's you're gonna now all of a sudden you have high melee attack and you have that augmented weapon strength, that gets boosted. So, just really good synergy with the roster and pretty much a staple of the early game. Now that being said, you will kind of transition out of these guys. Your more powerful armies are gonna, probably transition into Biggins and Black Orcs, and then your economy armies are probably just gonna be Goblins, just because of how efficient they are. But that being said, just because of their early game potential, I'd probably put them right there. But both of these are pretty simple, pretty standard. Now, some of the things that I think newer players can struggle with is some of the differences between, say, Orc Boys and Savage Orcs. What Savage is sort of like it's like a template that you kind of would like staple onto Orc Boys, and what you get is essentially less armor, less melee defense, more melee attack, frenzy, which is just a little bit more melee attack and damage essentially, and they're just much more offensively skewed. They also have war paint, which gives them physical resist. So what does that mean? It's just like less armor but more physical resist. Well, again, it kind of is the same against a lot of things, but if you happen to face things that have a higher amount of armor piercing, for example, Savage Orcs will be a lot better because their physical resist is essentially armor that isn't mitigated by armor piercing. Whereas if things have pretty light or almost non-existent armor piercing, then the actual just flat armor that Orc Boys have will probably be more mitigation. They are slightly faster as well, and the Frenzy, giving them more speed and charge bonus and whatnot, makes them much better at like actually flanking and pressuring backlines and such. So a lot of times what I'll have in my formation is, let's say I run a 5 Orc Boy front line. Maybe I'll have 2 Savage Orcs in the army, maybe 1 on each flank to kind of wrap around, or maybe I'll overload the right side and have the Savage Boys on the outside to come around, or maybe I'll have like 1 or 2 Savage Boys in the middle of the line, and I'll blast the line in the center with, say, magic or missile fire to try and blitz through the middle really quickly. And that's kind of what these guys are. They're, more offensively damage focused, so it's where you're going to be putting your pressures, kind of where you're going to want the Savage Orcs. That being said, I would definitely probably rank them weaker than Orc Boys overall, especially just in raw holding power. They're very low melee defense, like 16 at base, not really augmented that much through skills or through tech trees. Really means that these guys just don't do good in like sustained infantry fight necessarily. So I probably would put them weaker than Orc Boys in general, but it's really important if you want to play Greenskins, either in campaign or in multiplayer, that you kind of just understand the nuance between the different things. Really, the physical resist, the fact that they're more offensively statted, that kind of thing. Just think a bit more strategically on how to use them, that kind of thing. I definitely think a couple in your early game armies can do a lot of good, but a lot of times you won't necessarily have them because you need the Savage building in very specific settlements to get them. So, not something necessarily you have to be super concerned about, but it's good to know the differences. Now, as far as the 2 Biggins, so we have the standard variant and we do have the Savage variant. Where is that Savage variant at? Right here. The Biggins are really good against large. They do bonus damage against them, essentially. Other than that, they're pretty much the same as their smaller cousins. They just tend to have slightly more stats, a lot more HP, a lot more weapon damage, slightly less models. Kind of what you'd expect going from, one tier to the next. And strategically, they're not really that much different. That being said, if you think about the best way to use them is going to be crunching large things to make use of that bonus. Large units, what do large units generally have? They generally have a little bit more speed, more often than not. They also have usually more AP damage more often than not. So 9 times out of 10, the Savage variant for the Biggins is just going to be better. It's going to have what you need. Now, again, this isn't a end-all, be-all kind of thing. If it just happens to not have a lot of armor piercing, or it's just not particularly fast, then perhaps the regular big N variant will be better. But just something to think about. So what I would do with these guys, I'd actually put the Savage one above average, and the regular big N kind of in the average tier, just because that's just going to be what it is most of the time. But as long as you understand why I'm putting them there and what the Savage variant is good at and what the regular variant is good at, you'll be able to make the right strategic decision there. Again, usually these guys are sort of supplementing your front line, usually supplementing your Orc Boys around tier 3, before you get Black Orcs. And you kind of want these guys surrounding and crumping large if you can. But it's not like they can't do work on the front line, absolutely. It's just that's not necessarily what they're most efficient at. Alright, Nasty Skulkers. Now this one's a bit of a weird unit. It has Stalk, so it can usually get itself into really good positions, but it is very slow. So it's susceptible, for example, like this, he's not particularly good on the flanks because cavalry can just end up randomly running into it and essentially just completely destroying the unit. It has horrendous armor, horrendous melee defense, really bad leadership, and really bad HP. So, an extremely squishy unit. Can get crumped by just about everything, but it does have a really good base melee attack, and it actually has a passive that allows it to get even more melee attack if it's winning. So essentially, if it gets the jump, or if it gets the flank, or whatever the case might be, it can really do a lot of damage. So it's a bit of a melee glass cannon, which is normally not good, but it does have Stalk, so you can usually, with a little bit of practice with it, you can actually do a lot of damage with it. And it also has a little bit of slow utility too in its smoke bomb, which is pretty cool. The two uses for Nasty Skulkers are usually going to be either sneaking around the enemy backline and trying to get onto their missile units generally, or artillery, or whatever the case might be, and they'll just tear them to pieces, just absolutely tear them. You can also use them a bit defensively and protect your own backline because of that Stalk. The enemy won't get a jump onto it. And this has both campaign and multiplayer applications. In the campaign, a lot of it's just sort of a judgment call. Like, for example, if you're playing against Bretonnia, and they just happen to have like 6 units of Knight Errants, which a lot of early Bretonnia armies will actually have, you'll probably want to be a bit more defensive with these guys, because you can almost certainly expect that they're going to come wrap around and challenge your own flanks and backlines. So these guys can help supplement and defend that. Whereas against other races that don't necessarily have a lot of backline pressure, you'll be a lot more offensive with these guys. And like I said, if they do actually get the correct engage, they will just tear things to shreds. It's a pretty cool unit, really, in thematic, but they get caught out and they're just done. As far as where I'd put them, honestly, the thing is with the Greenskins is that you have options upon options upon options for backline harass and whatnot. And really, I feel like it's kind of a weak unit overall. I do think I love having 1 or 2 of these guys early on, but I almost completely outphase them by like tier 3, especially by tier 4. They're basically not going to be in any armies. I won't run them in my goblin armies. I definitely think they have potential, though. Lightly, less is more kind of thing. A couple of these can do a lot of work, and I would definitely encourage any new Greenskin player to at least give them a try. Maybe end up liking them just a bit more than I do. It's a bit micro. It's a bit heavy on the micro. It's something I always have to keep in mind on, and I wouldn't say the reward is necessarily that great. So it's always nice to have things that you can kind of set and forget about, like your very strong infantry. Let's see here. We got multiple goblin variants. So we have Night Goblins. We have Night Goblin Fanatics. So what's the difference? Essentially, they have the exact same stat line, except the Night Goblins Fanatics version, which you get at tier 4, has the very powerful Loons ability, which is sort of like a mini vortex spell that destroys groups of infantry. Like, it's really strong. That being said, as far as their actual stats go, they have pretty terrible stats, pretty bad leadership, pretty bad armor even, and you just don't want them in a sustained fight where they're taking the full brunt of an enemy attack. They do apply poison, however, so this is kind of like the Nasty Skulkers, where they're really good on the flank. If you can kind of wrap around with these guys, where they're not taking that damage, they'll apply poison, and they'll just help, another unit on the front line win even harder. But that's not really what you want. Your infantry is so strong anyways. You get poison from so many other sources. Poison is like a massive theme throughout the entire roster. That the regular variant especially, I would honestly classify it as very weak. It's just not what you want to be doing. I can't think of a comp where I want it. That being said, the Fanatic version, which has the powerful Loon ability, I'm actually going to put in strong. That ability is so powerful. It's arguably too strong in multiplayer, for example, because one cast of Loons could just make up the money of the unit. But even in campaign, it's just really nice to be able to deal massive amounts of damage to even elite infantry. It's almost too strong. One thing I'll do with my Goblin armies, kind of a staple of them, in fact, is I'll run 5 regular Goblin warriors up front. They're going to have the scrap armor upgrade. They're going to have the physical resist from all the attacks and stuff, and they're going to be surprisingly tanky with silver shields. And then I'll run a Fanatics Night Goblin on each flank to get a really good Loons cast off, create tons of mad value there, and then kind of flank around and apply poison where it's needed and just help my infantry win. Again, these armies are extremely cheap, and the Night Goblin Fanatics are just kind of a staple of that. And the thing is, with the Fanatic ability, the ability's powerful, but you're only paying like an extra 20, 25 gold for it. It's kind of crazy, actually. And really, the existence of the Fanatic version, it completely makes this guy irrelevant. It's such a massive upgrade for virtually no cost. The only difference is you get these at tier 3 and these guys at tier 4. But at tier 3, oh no, wait, hold on. You get these guys. Yeah, you do get these guys at tier 4. Yeah, at tier 3, you have so much better stuff going on that, these are completely worthless. I think if you got the regular Night Goblins at tier 2 and these guys at tier 4, maybe there's a bit more of an argument, but as I said, I would think it's arguably one of the weakest units on the entire roster, and you'd probably go through most of your campaigns never even using the regular version. But the Fanatic is very, very strong. On to Black Orcs here, the elite infantry. Now, Black Orcs are basically designed to win the infantry fight. They have very high armor. They do extremely high AP damage. They're really good in infantry versus infantry skirmishes. They're arguably the best in the game at it as far as infantry goes. Not necessarily the best infantry at killing large units or stopping charges from dinosaurs like a lot of elite halberd units. There's some other infantry that do some things better. But the Black Orcs is the best when it comes to infantry versus infantry fighting. And it sort of more or less guarantees that you're going to win the front line without other factors considered. Your end game armies are almost always going to run at 5 of these guys on average. Honestly, if you're talking about like Grimgore, you can honestly run like 7 of these guys, which is a really wide front line, but he pushes Black Orcs so hard that it's probably just the right thing to do, honestly. I probably wouldn't go higher than 7, but Black Orcs are just absolute beasts. And honestly, I have to put them in the top of the tier. Now, this is a concept I want to explain, especially if you're a new player. Just because something is a higher tier and higher stats doesn't mean in all situations it's going to be stronger. There's a lot of attributes that you have to consider that can make something better than others. So, for example, Black Orcs is generally, in most situations, going to be your best infantry, right? But what if you were going up against, say, like Skaven weapons teams, for example? You might not know this, but it takes a Skaven's weapon teams about 5 times as long to kill one unit of Goblin Warriors as it does to Black Orcs. Well, how can that be possible? Well, think about it. they do so much damage that they kill units of Black Orcs anyways. And there's 120 models of Goblin Warriors versus 60 Black Orcs. Plus, these guys have silver shields, giving them 55% missile resist. So, it's not always clear cut with these units, like what is best. It's not always just that, you know, oh, more stats, more HP, more weapon damage is just always better. You got to think critically about it. Like, Black Orcs do have a big weakness against heavy AP missiles. The Casket of Souls from the Tomb Kings, a lot of Vampire Coast units, especially the Queen Bess, but just like guns in general, Dark Elves, and Skaven can absolutely tear these guys to pieces before they even make it to the army. So a good concept to think about, especially this. I guess this is more of a multiplayer thing. You would basically not bring Black Orcs probably into heavy AP missile damage just in general. But even in campaign, if you know what faction you're going up against, like say Skaven, you might just consider not even bringing Black Orcs, just because Goblin Warriors are just going to be a better holding front line. It's kind of funny how that works out, that a trash unit can be better than that, but it's not just about the tiers you got to think about. You really have to think about the attributes, right? Like, you know, so Orc Boys have bronze shields, but are generally weaker than Biggins, right? But if you're going up against a mostly missile faction, you know, sometimes slightly less melee stats and melee HP could make up for it with the bronze shields. It's just something to consider. And it's definitely going to take your game to the next level if you are willing to use some of these lesser units if they bring specific attributes that will do very well against certain armies or whatever. So, just something to consider. But that being said, you know, even though that is one weakness of Black Orcs is the complete lack of shields, their main job is getting into the front line, winning the front line engagement. They're so phenomenal at doing that, and I have to put them in S tier because they essentially mean that you are almost always going to have the front line fight won, and that is a strategic concept that translates into the flanks, into the reserve, everything else. Like, your flanking play, it is a certain way because you know you're going to win the front line, basically. Like, that's just something that you can almost always guarantee as the Greenskins. So, very phenomenal unit. Let's do some of these Regiment of Renowns. Let's see, how many melee troops do we have? I know we got 2 Night Goblin variants. And we have the Crimson Killers. I think that's it. So, with Regiment of Renowns, of course, you can only have 1 per campaign. You can only have 1 per multiplayer battle. The regular Night Goblin Regiment of Renown gives Armor Sundering, which is a really, really powerful debuff. Unfortunately, it's on the regular Night Goblin, which again, it's like, you kind of want to get around and flank with this guy, but if he literally gets in contact with anything, he just folds like it's nothing. And it's borderline unusable because of that fact. And honestly, it's such a poor unit. You really need the Fanatics variant of these guys to justify where they're at. It's just the way that it is. I mean, think about it. It's hard to use melee in Armor Sundering anyways, because you got to make sure, you know, they're slow. It takes some time to get in position. You know, once they're in position, then you're putting all your firepower into it and everything else. And you'd rather that on something that's somewhat survivable, so you can actually have some time to make use of that Armor Sundering, or if it takes some hits on its way there. Where this thing, it just gets blown up wherever it goes. You know, if the enemy focuses it with anything, it just destroyed. I don't want the powerful Armor Sundering ability on such a flimsy, you know, weak Goblin unit, essentially. I mean, they are far more squishy than the Goblin Warrior variant. That's just something to consider, you know. So, just a poor unit. The 8-Peak Loonings. This is a Goblin Fanatic variant. And it's the same as the regular, except it has Unbreakable, which essentially that completely negates the poor leadership. And it pretty much guarantees that you're going to get 2 loons casts off. Oftentimes, you'll even get 3 loons casts off, which is incredibly strong. I mean, like I said, each cast of the loon's ability can often net you the value of the unit. In campaign, that's less of a big deal because you're more concerned about, individual power in a 20 stack. But the ability's strong enough. Trust me, it's definitely worth. And I would say, to me, this thing has to be in the same tier. I mean, it's even better, obviously, because Unbreakable is just a raw upgrade. But it is just a regiment around. I wouldn't say it's necessarily top tier. I normally don't run these guys in my Doom stacks anyways, because even though a lot of these tools are so good at killing infantry, the Greenskins are just phenomenal at killing infantry. So, like, it's not necessarily fantastic that you have 17,000 ways of decimating infantry. At some point, you're going to have your favorites. So I'm not going to put them all up here just because they're so good at doing that job. It's a bit of a redundant role, to be honest. But very powerful units. Great in your economy armies. Will carry, again, 800 gold stacks, defending your borders, able to basically hold until 200 pretty consistently. It's pretty awesome. Now, the Crimson Killers, they have splash attack. They're a Black Orc variant with splash attacks. I believe as far as models go, instead of having a single great axe, they have, I believe they're dual wielding axes. But either way, it's just like more damage output, a lot more damage output. I believe hard win against literally any infantry in the game, like Regiment of Renown, anything. And it's obviously S tier. Now it's a Regiment of Renown, so you only get one a faction. Of course, it's going to be pushed. In multiplayer, it's probably worse than Black Orcs because being 300 gold, it's more of a liability. If the enemy focuses it down, you can lose even more value. And, a lot of people would be like, well, Black Orcs are so good. Do we really need to push it? But ultimately, it is better, so it has to be in that tier, It's a Regiment of Renown, so. Alright, I think that's all for the infantry category. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about it. Just overall, I'll probably do an army comp guide separate and maybe showcase some of the comps in battle. But generally speaking, 5 to 7 Orc Boys early on does you a lot of good. 5 to 7, probably more 5, but, all the way up to 7 Black Orcs in your end game, sort of like powerful carry armies, is pretty standard. And then the Goblins of Goblin Warriors and Goblin Fanatics, kind of a mix as you see fit in your economy armies, is kind of like where you're at, And then everything else is like more situational. Biggins are good, as like a transitioning unit. They can even be in the Doom stacks at a couple of them just to deal with large. They are actually better at killing large than Black Orcs, funny enough. Only slightly, though. Again, it's all about the different attributes that they bring, as opposed to, what tier that they're at, or just necessarily a few stats. You got to kind of look at the whole package of the unit. But yeah, Black Orcs, definitely top tier for sure. Alright, let's do Missile Infantry next. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a weaker part of the faction. They're not great at missile play. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they tend to be somewhat low range for missile units. Obviously elves and empire and dwarves. They're all going to outrange you, which makes sense. Also, the whole design of the faction is kind of very aggressively statted. We talk about magic. You talk about all their entire toolkits. You talk about their roster, how, it's much higher in melee attack than melee defense, and how the WOG boosts damage output, right? It's a very aggressively themed faction. They're not good at holding and defending. Obviously, these guys are, the Goblin Warriors, but that's about it. And ultimately, Goblin Warriors are still, it's more of a economy pick. It's never going to be, endgame worthy, except Crown's campaign. That's an exception. So, just fundamentally, you're not as good at missile play as you are as other factions. That being said, it's still a very important part of campaign and multiplayer. And it's offset by the fact that they can at least do some damage in melee. Now, when it says on the tooltip, decent melee combatant, I would say it's a poor melee combatant, but it's just enough that maybe it can help finish a unit off or two or whatever. Or especially if like, a group of knights get into the back line, maybe three of them coming together and like crumping a knight might actually be able to do a little bit of work. It's not a great trade, but it's something because you're often using your missile units to fire at the enemy and just sort of like leaving them there, to do whatever. And you are going to challenge your flanks, but if the enemy gets around you, you're usually only going to have one or two units in reserve, and it's just hard to defend. The Greenskins don't really box or like play like a heavy, reserve thing like, say Empire, for example, or whatever the case might be. So just keep that in mind. So they're definitely on the weekend, but, missile units are great. They're very important. And I would still say that you're probably going to be using them for the vast majority of both the campaign and multiplayer battles. As far as where we would place them, I think we just have the 5 variants. No, we do have a regiment around as well. Yeah, right there. Okay. Goblin archers, they're going to be pretty important in your economy armies. They start off really, really bad. Very poor damage output, very poor accuracy. Even with a high amount of models, they just have a really hard time killing anything. They do end up scaling, however, ultimately better than the orc versions, just like the Goblin Warriors and the Orc Boys. They actually become slightly better than these guys later on between skills and techs and everything else. So, I'm almost inclined to put them in average. Just because of how important they are in the campaign. Because even in the late game, you do rely on these guys pretty heavily. One huge thing that they do get is the scrap upgrade for plus 400% armor piercing. Now, to be fair, that is only 4 additional armor piercing, but it's 120 models. So, when they shoot an entire volley, each of those arrows is getting plus 4, missile damage. So essentially, it ends up being a pretty massive damage increase. And it's not like they're going to be tearing apart like Chimerian War Sphinxes like anytime soon. But it is enough AP damage that, a couple of groups of these guys will take down anything given the time. And that does give them, a really powerful leash late in the game, for those specific Goblin armies like I mentioned. Goblin armies are just really, really good. If you just need coverage, the Greenskin economy isn't good enough to support tons and tons of very powerful armies. You really need to rely on goblins to give you good coverage, and then you can have your big boy armies, a couple of them to really push through and take a lot of territory. But goblin armies are absolutely fantastic. You practicing with them, you'll really learn to respect how good the goblins can be. Now, Orc Error Boys. They do a little bit more damage than the goblins. They're obviously better early on, for sure. They are slightly more expensive. They don't scale as well. They don't have as good as scrap upgrades, for example, or as good as skills, or as good as tech. It's basically like the triple whammy. So, it's a pretty poor unit, I would say. When I put this in below average, make sure you understand that you don't want to just overload with a stack of like 19 Orc Boys in the early game, because it's going to be hard for them to all get in position to contribute very well. You're going to want to have some Error Boys in the back, and they're still going to do some damage. It's just not as good as other factions. So it's just important that you understand strategically that they're on the weak side, but nonetheless, they're still important, especially in the early game. And then the Savage Orc Era Boys. So again, just a quick reminder on the Savage template. You lose a little bit of melee defense. You gain a little bit of melee attack. You gain some physical resist. So it has that little thing of, they're slightly better against armor piercing, that kind of thing, and they're a little bit faster. Now, for a missile unit, most of that stuff is pretty irrelevant, right? They do essentially the same damage. They actually cost a little bit more. The speed is a little bit nice. I believe it's, what, 31 speed for these guys versus 37 for the Savage variant, I think. So they can actually kite and reposition just that little bit better. That is definitely good, but is it worth the cost? Honestly, these are like dead even. I mean, you just kind of build whichever building you have. You know, if you're in Wurzag's area, you're gonna probably have the Savage Orc building. If you're anywhere else, you're probably gonna have the regular variant, and you're just gonna build what you have. Even though there are some niche cases where one will be stronger than the other for whatever reason. Like, for example, a lot of it will be against AP missiles in particular, which is going to be mostly where the discrepancy would come from when the missile units are trading into each other. Then yeah, the Savage one variant would be better against armor piercing, and the Arrow Boys would be better against, you know, non basically. But you're just gonna build what you have, you know. You don't have to stress too hard about it. It's not a big enough a difference to really care. A lot of the differences between these two archetypes are more pronounced in the melee versions for sure. So now we have Night Goblin Archers and Night Goblin Fanatics. These guys have poison, which is fantastic on a missile unit, generally speaking. So not only are they doing missile damage, you know, they're also supporting, that kind of thing. The Fanatic variant is not as big of an upgrade as the melee version because... So, the Fanatic ability has a very short range, and by the time your Archer needs to use it, it's probably in, like... It's either in a bad position, or it's going to get destroyed anyways. You know, if you have, like, Empire Calf charging your missile units down... You know, one Fanatic's cast is going to take out a couple of units, but it's not going to stop your missile units from dying. So, honestly, it doesn't really matter. That being said, it's only another 20, 25 gold, and just having the Fanatic's ability just in case is obviously an upgrade, right? Otherwise, the stats are the same, so... What I would probably do is I'd probably do something like this. And I'll put this guy maybe above average. Actually, I'll put him in weak. Because Poison Arrows is a very good bit of utility. They don't get the scrap upgrade for the armor piercing damage. So these guys end up doing more damage overall. But, you know, it's nice to have a couple of Poison Arrows as well. A lot of times what I'll do is... I might overload, and I might do like 7 Goblin Archers, but I might do another like 5 or 2 split, or even like a 4 and 3 split. Just depending on a lot of it, just how I feel. But, you know, especially if a lot of single entities are starting to become really common for whatever reason, you know, Poison's very good against them. And then we have the Rusty Heirs. Now, this thing is an absolute staple in multiplayer. And it's easily the best archer unit you have in the entire roster. It is a regimental round, so you only get 1 per faction. Per campaign, I guess. Better way of saying it. It applies armor sundering at range, which is insane. So, the way you want to use the Rusty Heirs is you want an army comp that is missile focused for this guy to really take effect. You don't really want the Rusty Heirs as sort of like, you know, one of like a couple of missile units just kind of randomly doing his thing. I mean, yeah, he'll have decent damage output, but you're really not maximizing on his potential. But if you had an army that had at least 5 missile units, maybe even like 6 or 7, you know, it just ends up being that kind of comp. You just felt like having a missile army, you skilled out for it. You get this guy in there, and that entire strategy is going to take off because he applies armor sundering at range, and then that's going to boost the damage output of all your other missile units as they focus fire targets down. And you will absolutely melt things, and you will feel almost like an Elven faction other than the shortest range. But, you know, Elven factions, they can absolutely shred targets from range, and it's going to actually feel like that kind of level of damage output on a greenskin comp. That's pretty incredible. Again, it's a regiment of renown, so you're not going to be able to do this a lot. But he's really cool how he's sort of like this, build around me kind of regiment around. Those are my favorite kind of regiments renown, by the way, the sort of build around me's. And honestly, he has to be at the top of the list. He has to be S tier. Again, staple of multiplayer, phenomenal in campaign, and just an all-around great unit. Just make sure you kind of build around him, though. So keep that in mind. You really want to. Alright, I think that's most of the infantry and missiles. I guess I'll do trolls before I get into cav, just because they're monstrous infantry. So I'll move them all together here. Here's the swamp things, and there's the regular trolls. Okay. So I hear from sometimes online, sometimes from new players, that trolls aren't very good. Trolls are pretty good, actually. They're pretty tanky. They do a lot of weapon damage, but if you're having problems using trolls, you're probably not using them very well. For starters, they have really low leadership, so if they get surrounded, they tend to rout super, super quickly, and that's probably what's happening. They are faster than your infantry, so if you have your entire army and you send everything forward and you have trolls in there, if you're not careful, your trolls might run ahead, and they're going to get to the enemy first, and then they're going to take a bunch of damage, and they're going to instantly rout. In fact, they can even shatter really, really quickly if they take enough damage quick enough. So their regen won't even matter because they'll just shatter. This is obviously really bad. You really want these guys. The way to think about it is they need to be handheld a little bit. You want them supporting your front line. So you'll engage with the front line first, and you'll have your trolls like either intermixed or like directly behind kind of thing. And a general rule of thumb I have with trolls is like less is more. Like 2 units of trolls is oftentimes perfect. You can even go 3 against maybe like a really heavily armored faction. Like at tier 3, 3 units of stone trolls against dwarves is fantastic. Just as an example. But you can't overload on them because you won't have enough things to be around them to support them, right? Like a front line of trolls would be freaking horrible. Like your front line would almost immediately collapse. It's so. I think for a lot of people's problems with them, they're just not using them well enough. As long as you go with a less is more mentality and you keep them, handheld, not rushing ahead, that kind of thing, you're going to have a lot more success with them. And you'll notice that your trolls actually rack up tons and tons of kills. It's just not a unit you can have tons of. As far as the differences go, the generic troll, coming in at tier 2, it's really, really strong at tier 2. But it just falls off really, really quickly, and you tend to get to tier 3 really quickly anyways, so honestly, for the vanilla variant, I probably would put in weak. Yeah, I probably would put in weak. You just get to these too quickly. You're also incentivized to get to these guys, by the way, because it has the River Troll Hag, which is something that you probably want fairly early in most campaigns. So you're already building the buildings for it, so oftentimes you'll get a couple of trolls just because it's in your path, and they just do a ton of work. Now, there's the river trolls, and then there's stone trolls. So stone trolls have missile and magic resist, they have a lot more armor, they have more weapon strength, they're just overall a much better unit. And significantly better than river trolls, basically 49 times out of 50. Well, what do river trolls have? Well, they have aquatic, so they're supposed to be this, your go-to option for like the water maps. Here's the thing: the greenskins are in the middle of the Badlands. Like, you just don't have a lot of these maps where this unit would theoretically be good. Just keep in mind that they are aquatic, I guess, and if there's a part in your campaign where you're having a lot of water maps with like rivers and streams and stuff, which is mostly in like the jungle is like the big area. There's a couple of variants in all across the world, but it's hard to rely on, especially when stone trolls just completely dominate over them. They also have an aura that gives -6 melee attack, which suggests that, hey, they have a bit more utility than just being aquatic. But the thing is, the river troll hag is the same exact aura, and you're almost always getting that thing. So if you build the troll building, you're probably going to want to get a river troll hag and 2 stone trolls in almost every situation. It's hard to ever imagine getting the river trolls, and it's just, unfortunately, it's outclassed completely by the building that it's in and the other units that you get with the building. Just keep in mind in the back of your head, like if you know you have for whatever reason you just know, or you're fighting in a lot of water maps, give these guys a run. They'll probably do a lot better, but I do have to put them in the weak tier because of that. Whereas stone trolls are very, very good. Both in multiplayer, both in campaign. The missile resist helps offset their weakness of being a little bit on the big side. And like I said, they're just a lot tankier. They do a lot more damage. And they're just going to rack up hundreds of kills in most of your battles, especially at tier 3. But even, honestly, they're good enough to run into a late game army, to be honest. I generally scale them or move these guys out about around tier 5, but honestly, it's pretty close. I think that there's an argument to be made for them. And the fact that you get them at tier 3 is insane. The thing about regeneration is it gets more value. The more HP, the more armor, the more resistances you have. So it's just like a perfect synergy there. The magic resistance helps offset the fire weakness, because most of the fire damage you'll take is magic. Not all of it, but most sources of it. Just a phenomenal unit. Just, again, keep in mind, less is more. Don't rush them ahead. Use them well, and these guys are going to do tons of work in your campaigns. And then we have the Swamp Finks, which is the River Troll Regiment of Renown, which does gain it gains Terror, which is interesting. What else does it gain here? Let me check real quick. I know it has one more thing. I don't use them that much. Oh, it has poison attacks. Well, poison is interesting. You have so many sources of poison, though. And terror, I wouldn't say is really that big of a deal. So, hold on, I misplaced where I put it. Right here. I'd probably put it at below average. It is definitely better. The poison utility and the terror utility is just... that's enough of an upgrade that it's something you should consider. But again, it's a River Troll variant. Unfortunately, there's no Stone Troll Regiment Renown variant, so it is what it is, basically. Kind of on the weak side. So I guess I was talking about, trolls. I guess they are more often than not generally weak, but the Stone Trolls really are just phenomenal units. Especially at tier 3, they're an absolute steal. All right, let's do Cav here. So we have, this is another part where we have Savage and regular variants. A lot of the same things apply. Your smaller Cav are anti-infantry specialists. They're really good at charging in and clearing waves, especially chaff, but generally you want to rear charge them into the front line or taking down missile infantry with them. The big end variants are your anti-large, just like it is with here. So these are the guys that you want to have on the flanks to challenge the flanks. So if they have a bunch of cav, you're going to want the big ends to be able to challenge that. Now, big ends aren't the greatest cav, and they'll generally lose against other cav, especially if it's an anti-large variant. So why would I even consider using that strategy? Well, you have a lot of things that can help these guys out. You have poison arrow support. You have Spider Rider support, so Spider Riders for a very cheap cost can get in there, apply poison, allow you to win those trades. You have Fists of Gork, which is a spell from the big Wa. You have Sneaky Stabbin', a spell from the little Wa. So you want to make sure you're buffing these guys. You have Wa that you can pop. So there's a lot of things that you can do to actually allow you to win the trades. And like I said earlier in this video, just because it's worse strategic, like it's a worse cav unit overall and relatively weak on the roster for what it does, you really need to make sure that you practice using these guys and practice microing and buffing these guys, because you don't want to just always concede the flanks all the time. That's a very bad thing to do, especially when you can challenge them with good micro and good ability usage. That being said, as far as like the Savage versus the regular variant, I mean the Savage ones do have Frenzy, so they have more charge bonus. You know, they're more offensively statted, which I feel like is a slight benefit to Cav. But again, it's a lot like this dichotomy right here. It really is. Where would I place them? That's the question. I think the best way I can put it is if I was doing sustained combat, I would probably, let's take the Biggins for example. If I was doing sustained combat, where I was just putting them into another group of Cav, I was applying poison, and I'm using my magic, but then I'm going to kind of forget about them for 45 seconds and let them do their thing, then I'd rather have the regular variant over the Savage. But if I was, say, rear charging a big monster with the Savage Orcs, I'd rather have the offensive stats and the more damage and the more charge bonus, because I'm not getting that damage in return. I hope that makes sense. And the kind of same thing kind of applies here. If you're charging these guys into infantry, especially on the front line, like a rear charge, you know, the regular variant probably better. But if you're cycle charging more, then the Savage variant is definitely going to come out on top. So I think where I would place them, I mean, they're all so similar. It's really hard. These I can differentiate a little bit more because you're just always going to have a bunch of infantry as the greenskins. These, you know, you're usually not going to have as much of. And again, it's kind of one of those things where if you have the Savage building, you'll probably build this, and you have this. It's weird because you don't always, oftentimes, have that much of a choice either. So a lot of times the little discrepancies don't even matter that much. I mean, they ultimately they just do the same function by the end of the day. It's not like, you know, by the end, if you want to charge in the back line and you have these guys as opposed to these guys, you're still going to do it, right? So it's not something you have to think too hard about. Just try to keep in mind some of the minor differences, and maybe you can eke out a strategic advantage over a campaign. But most of the time, it's not going to matter. I think I would probably lump them all into the below average, though. I think I might move that a bit later, if I can think of another reason. The Broken Tusk mob is the big and Regiment of Renown. What this guy has is he has Encourage, which this is a lot like the Rusty Arrows, where it's a bit of a build-a-mountery. So what this guy really excels at is just buffing the leadership of a really powerful flank, like a flank overload. Like maybe your left flank is specifically going to be defensive with Poison Missile Cav, just kind of holding off the advance, and you're really pushing hard on the right flank, and you're kind of trying to overload it, essentially. I'll probably do a video on like army formations at a future date, but essentially this guy is phenomenal for an overload because he's like, you know, he's an encouraging kind of like mini lord, essentially, which is really, really cool. Other than that, nothing too much special than him, but I think he's clearly at least average, you know. Efficient because he's a Regiment of Renown, has Encourage, kind of a builder on me. Not pushed like the Rusty Arrows is, but, you know, pretty cool nonetheless. Really cool to build an army comp around him, for sure. A flank overload, specifically. Orc Chariots. Chariots are, you know, really good at killing infantry. greenskins have plenty of that. You know, they are slightly micro intensive, which is, you know, something to consider. I mean, if something could do its job without having to micro it as much, you know, I would definitely consider that an upgrade. There's plenty of things that you have to micro in a battle. And I'm not saying that chariots are bad because of that, but, you know, it's something to consider. And it just does a role that a lot of your roster also does really well. Chariots also have gotten weaker with a lot of the mass changes over time. They're still okay, but I feel like fewer factions do chariot play anymore. But you know, they still can be good. It's a chariot, so it can still rack up 100 kills. So I almost don't want to rank it too weak, but at the same time, I don't know. It's a slightly worse, slightly more micro intensive version of things that you already do a lot. And I'm already not super high in chariots, even though I know they can do really well, and I've had racked up plenty of kills on them before. I think I will put them in weak. I think you get them at tier 4 too, which by that time the vast majority of your roster is unlocked. So I feel like these guys should be pushed down a tier, just to make them more competitive. They would have a bit more of a niche against, say, dwarves, for example. Like, chariots are traditionally very good against dwarves, but because this comes in at tier 4, it's the same tier as black orcs and like other tools that you get to deal with dwarves. I don't know. It's in a weird spot in the roster, and ultimately, it's kind of like the river trolls, where you're probably just, this is one of the few units you probably won't do in an entire campaign just because of where it sits. So let's see, our squid cav, kind of, I guess they're monsters. They're kind of cavalry. Squigs are unfortunately also on the weak side. They're really cool to watch animations for, but they just have horrible combat stats. Like, horrible combat stats. Like, the regular variant has Rampage, and with the bad leadership and just bad stats in general, what will likely happen is he'll charge in. You kind of almost want to cycle charge him a little bit. I mean, they don't even necessarily have amazing charge bonuses, but maybe you kind of want to cycle charge a little bit, and he could just insta Rampage. Like, it's that low, or it could just be in a bad spot. Like, you really have to execute well on him, and the reward is not that good for the amount of execution that he takes. And as soon as he rampages, his stats are so low, like, he's just going to die. Just straight up. Like, 25 melee attack, 18 melee defense. Like, where's the reward for using this guy? He comes in at tier 3. Wait a minute, no. Yeah, he does come in at tier 3. Yeah, there's one building that does both the squig units at tier 3. Which is like a real head scratcher, because he feels like a tier 1 unit, I'm not going to lie. So yeah, it's just overall a weak unit. The Night Goblin variant doesn't rampage, which makes it significantly better, but it still just has poor combat stats. And at tier 3, it just, like, what's the niche of this guy? You know, I mean, he's worse than the various cav units that you have to kind of do his job. And the Regiment of Renown, what does this guy get? Oh, he gets Scaly Skin, that's right. Makes him a bit tankier, but kind of in the same tier. Just overall, the squigs are a bit overwhelming. Now, if you do like the idea of squigs and you want to use them, there is a build that is surprisingly competitive in campaign with the Night Goblin boss, because the Night Goblin boss has several personal buffs in his skill tree that buff squigs, you know, and then you can also obviously buff squigs through the armory tree. So there's enough augmentation there that they actually do alright. I would actually say, you know, they kind of go up to like an average tier. Now, with all those skills and stuff, you would think they'd be higher. They never become incredible. But, you know, it's just like everything else in campaign. You can make it work. And if you just really like the idea of these guys running around and chomping the heads off of people, the animations are funny as heck. You know, you can definitely make it work with that lord in particular. But overall, I have to rate him weaker on just the poor stats. Not much of a charge bonus, not much of a reward for microing them well. Um, and just them coming in at tier 3 with their own building is just like really weird. Their own building is it's a boon and a curse. It's a curse because early on your slots are really competitive, so you just simply do not have room to build one of these, and it's not enough of a reward to. It's a boon because you can build it in a minor settlement, so like once your province is more well developed, you can build these in a minor settlement and essentially have the entire chain unlocked because it's just one building. But I don't know. Use them if you like them. Just do them with the Night Goblin War Boss. But ultimately, they're never going to be amazing. Light Cav. We got Wolf Riders. We got the Moon Howlers. We got Spider Riders. So Wolf Riders come in, starting their own chain. It has the Spider Riders, the Wolf Riders, and the Ragnarok. Coming in at tier 2, they do fulfill a pretty good niche, basically like every other wolf unit does in every other faction. They are only used for backline harass pretty much exclusively, and to chase off units, I guess. Their really fast speed makes them really exceptional at it. They can get around like Cav, for example. Like, it's just really hard to defend against these guys. A lot of factions don't have the tools early on. Like against Skaven specifically. Like if you're playing Grimgor or Wurzag and you're just having a bunch of Skaven problems in the Badlands, a couple of these guys is going to make your life so much easier. It's going to have the battle time. Instead of you just having Orc Boys and Arrow Boys and just running around and chasing all these fleeing Skaven and getting Warp Lightning to death and having massive casualties, these guys are going to instantly crump the missiles. They're going to chase those units off the battlefield, and they're going to make the overall battle so much cleaner, more efficient, more time efficient, but also just significantly less casualties, right? So they do have a really good niche there. That being said, you phase out of these guys really quickly. There's just better options. At tier 3, they're going to get completely outclassed. So they're essentially like, just 100% an early game unit. And in multiplayer, of course, you would use them if you just want the cheapest source of backline disruption possible. Kind of similar concept. I'd probably put them at below average, just because they get outscaled so quickly. That being said, the Spider Riders are a similar version. A little slower, slightly better stats, but it's nothing to sneeze at for sure. But these guys apply poison, which gives them the additional rule. So they have the rules of backline harass and chasing off the battlefield, which is great. But they can also help support your cav on the flanks. They can help support your infantry by applying poison. Poison is very strong. Poison is very important to this faction. The more powerful the enemy is, the more value you get out of that debuff. So, Spider Riders are, essentially the only reason why these guys are kind of low is because these guys are just really good. And I think I would have to put them... Are they above average, though? Again, he's going to get completely outclassed by something even farther up. I'd probably put him at average. We got better options yet for this kind of thing. The Moon Howlers are a Regiment of Renown, so one per campaign, or one per faction at a time. One per multiplayer battle. They apply Terror, which is really good on a cheap unit, especially more so in multiplayer. You can get a Terror source so cheaply is kind of crazy. Really good in combination with Lore of Death. Lore of Death has a leadership bombing tech to it, where you apply both aspect of the Dreadnought and the AoE leadership debuff to really hit leadership hard. You do that with a rear charge with these guys as well. Like you can just like insta route like low leadership things. And if you just let the battle go on for, a minute or so and just kind of let them take a little bit of sustained damage before you do that, if you just sort of time it well is basically what I'm saying, where you'll tank it down to 0, you can cause some devastating mess routes much earlier than what should be. So he has sort of a niche there, but that's specifically with Lord of Death, right? It kind of another regiment around that's a bit of a build around me. You have this guy in there with the express person of utilizing that terror well. Otherwise, that's his only boon over the normal variant, so why else would you take him? Um, Again, I love regiment rounds like that. I think I do have to put him in above average because that leadership bounding strategy is so powerful. Let's see, pump wagons. I think they're classified as war machines. But I'm gonna do pump wagons next. They're kind of like chariots, but I know they're classified as war machines. But let me get them together. This is the regiment now. This is the normal variant. So the normal variant, it's just kind of a bad chariot, but it is expendable and super cheap. It's nice to have such a cheap and expendable usage of this kind of thing. It's a little bit on the unique side in that regard. It kind of reminds me of the Moon Howlers, or just the regular Wolf Riders, where it's like it has its use, but it gets outscaled very quickly. I think I put it in the exact same tier. Then in tier 3, we have the spiky rollers and the flappers. And what essentially we have is the spiky rollers apply a debuff. I believe it is armor sundering. I think it is armor sundering. Let me check real quick. I can't exactly remember every single stat perfectly. Yeah, it is armor sundering. Yeah, and then the flappers have strider. So if the terrain is like really hilly with like massive cannons and stuff, the strider is going to be clutch because I mean you're not slowed down by going up the hill, going through waters, that kind of thing. There's a right at the beginning of Grom's campaign, there's a map where there's like a big trench that goes through the middle. It's like the very first battle, and there's like a river that goes through it. And you have the spiky rollers variant, I think. Yeah, the spiky rollers variant. It'd be so nice if you had the flapper variant actually for that, which is kind of funny. But those maps are kind of rare. It's kind of the river troll problem where it's just like, you're paying extra for this ability that, how often is it going to be used? I guess the speed is something, but honestly, the flapper variant kind of falls a little bit for me. As opposed to the regular variant, if I'm going to be honest with you. Just because it just doesn't come up that often. It really doesn't. I don't know what else to say. It's the same problem that the River Troll has, really. But, again, just like the River Troll, keep in your mind, if you know that a map, for whatever reason, or if you're in an area where you're constantly fighting in these similar maps, so like these big gaps and whatever, getting the flapper variant could be clutch. So it's actually good, but it's so rare to actually be applied that way. And then the spiky rollers has armor sundering, which such a cheap and expendable use of armor sundering is really freaking good. It's just really good. They're not super survivable. They will eventually kind of get wore down and blow up, even cyclocharging them over and over again, but I mean, I'm just always really impressed by this unit, to be honest. I gotta put it above average. It's such an economy thing. They have an ability that allows them to just like push through lines super easily. So you're just constantly applying armor sundering to like massive clumps of units. It's really freaking good. And the Regiment of Renown, which is the Explodey Shrooms one, which has the ability to do like an AoE explosion around it, very good at killing infantry, also just, above average. They're not exceptional, but they're very fun, very good unit. I wish the Squigs were as good as these guys, because of just how cool they are. I love goblins. Just use them like chariots, use their abilities well. If they tend to get slowed down, give them that sort of unstoppable effect, or the effect that just allows them to push through, and use the explosion effect when you're massively clumped around. It's pretty self-explanatory with these guys. They're just good. Nice cheap units for tier 3 for sure. Well, tier 3 for one, and the regiment right out for the other. Okay, whew. Hopefully this video isn't terribly, terribly long. There's just a lot of units to get through. So we're on to missile cav and chariots. Yeah, these both have a so it's basically 3 variants and they each have a regiment of renown. So these cheap missile cav units are some of the best units on this entire roster. I'm gonna be honest with you. So you'll notice with the Goblin Wolf Riders that they do slightly less damage than a lot of your ground forces do. But here's the thing. It's slightly less damage on 92 speed. So you don't have to defend these guys. They can get around and get basically perfect positioning all the time. You can go behind the lines and just fire arrows into the back of the enemy, applying leadership debuffs, getting essentially close to maximum value out of your arrows. There's still the wolf variant, so you can send them into melee and you can disrupt missile units. You can chase off units off the field. You can chip away at large single entities. It's absolutely incredible how good these cheap missile cav are, and they're so hard to shut down because they're so ridiculously fast. It's incredible, and they're so cheap too. They really are so cheap. Obviously, they're a terror in multiplayer. In multiplayer, the problem is some factions just can't efficiently take them down. It's just like, what do you have that's going to chase these guys down? If you focus fire them down, you can do that, but they're so cheap that you don't even get that much value out of it anyways, and they're so fast that they'll actually dodge a lot of the missiles anyway. They're an absolute terror in multiplayer, and in campaign, they're amazing as well. The only thing is, they do have relatively low damage output, so it's not like they're going to be, carrying the game, but you have to consider that you're going to get always near max value out of those. And as long as you adjust them between melee and ranged and always make sure you're disrupting, chasing, all that kind of stuff, like, they just perform a lot of things. And normally I'd put them here, but because, again, they get outclassed later on, they're actually probably going to go here, because once you're higher, you get essentially what is arguably the best unit on the entire roster. So I'll put him there for now. The Regiment of Renown has its AP and non-AP values switched, so it's an armor-piercing variant. So generally against, it's pretty self-explanatory. Against armor targets, it has just significantly higher damage output. Not necessarily a build around your Regiment of Renown, because it's personal power. It's not armor sundering or anything. But just very, very cheap, high effective unit. You're pretty much always going to get maximum value out of it. It's pretty hard to not get the unit's cost and value, I'm going to be honest. And it has all the versatile things of these. Alright, so now on to, let me see if I can say this correctly. I think it's 5 words. Goblin, Spider, Rider, Archer, something like that. I know it's 5 words. It's a long title. I'm also getting kind of tired. These guys are an absolute terror. They're essentially these guys with poison. Yeah, I know, right? Pretty ridiculous. An absolute terror in multiplayer. But you might think, well, in campaign, their low damage output means they're probably not going to scale that far until late game, right? I mean, it's not like you'd have them in your late game armies. Yeah, you would, and it's still obviously probably the best unit on the entire roster, just straight up. These guys, almost all your strategies revolve around this guy and are capable of doing so around this guy. He can go around the back of the enemy front line and do the same thing, here, fire into the backs, but instead of doing all that, he's applying poison. Or you have him around the flanks with your cav, applying poison, allowing these guys even greater opportunities to succeed, right? In addition to magic spells. They can still charge enemy backlines. They can still chase units off. Like, these guys just do everything. They do everything except actually kill things very well. But that's fine because they facilitate all your strategies and your entire army so much that it doesn't matter that they don't do that much damage. They will essentially allow your black orcs to do more damage because you're poisoning the enemy, and the black orcs are going to take less damage because of that. Like, it is one of the greatest supportive style units in the entire game. Great design. Possibly too obnoxious and ridiculous, just because, super fast poison missile cav is just one hell of a combination. But it's just cool how good these guys are too. Just because it's such a cool unit. I mean, thematically, it's a crazy goblin riding a spider with poison spider arrow. I mean, it's an incredibly cool unit, and I'm glad that it's such an integral part of the roster. It also just feels good to play it because they're relatively skill expressive and micro intensive. Like, I would imagine that most new players don't use these guys very well. If they just kind of sit behind your own line and they're just kind of like, fire and arrows, trying to be a missile unit, because of their relatively low damage output, they probably get relatively unimpressive results. But you want a lot of your micro is going to be around these guys, making sure you're applying poison to the right things, right? Maybe switching targets, and going from the flanks, helping the cav, to going to help single entities, bring those guys down, to chasing off units. That feels good to play. It feels like you're microing well. It feels like you're strategizing. It's a very rewarding experience, and because the unit is so strong, it's really cool to see that kind of in play. So, possibly one of my all-time favorite units in the entire game, to be honest. One of the reasons why I love Greenskins so much is because I just love microing these guys. And by the way, even in my endgame armies, with Black Orc Foundations, tons of heroes, a lot of the powerful single entities, I'm still running 2 or 3 of these guys. You better believe it, because they are that good. And they're one of the best multiplayer units for you as well. I mean, it's just a phenomenal unit. The Regiment of Renown gets Stalk and Regeneration, which, Stalk gives you some shenanigans. Regeneration makes it even harder to bring down, so essentially they're going to heal up a lot of the missile chip damage that they kind of inevitably take over time in some cases. But it's a Goblin Spider Rider Archer. I mean, it has to be an S tier, right? It's not necessarily like a crazy upgrade, I don't think, but it is what it is, It's fantastic. Alright, the Goblin Chariot is different from the Orc Chariot in the sense that it's much cheaper, has a lot worse stats, as you'd imagine, but the Orc Chariot does not have an archery unit, where these guys do, and I believe it's 6 models, if I remember correctly. And the missile damage is not bad, really, all things considered. Missile units on a chariots are pretty decent because, when you rear charge things, you're also getting missile fire in the back of them as well. And from what I understand, if you fire a unit from the back and then you charge it from the back, it's 2 separate negative leadership modifiers. So they apply a pretty heavy leadership buff when used correctly. That being said, it just has relatively poor combat stats. It's not like that great at doing chariot things, if that makes sense. Like, just its general killing power compared to most chariots is relatively low, but it does have an archer on the back. Usually when I do use these guys, I end up racking up a decent amount of kills. So I think I do got to put them in the average tier. I don't think they're quite as... Well, honestly, they're probably right about the same as the Wolf Riders. But these are tiered. Actually, hold on. I mean, these guys are much faster. They're better at actually chasing things off the map, I would say, and disrupting backlines because of that speed. And they're a lot safer too, as opposed to these. Yeah, I think that's about right. Even though these do kill more things ultimately. And then the Regiment of Renown has Vanguard, which, if you're doing a Vanguard build, it's an upgrade. Vanguard gives you some shenanigans, but it's not that big of a deal. I would say it's about the same. It's just one regiment renowned, so. Alright. 3 artilleries. It's great that they have some artillery options, because it just gives them that additional strategic element. Now, they're not as good. It's a lot like their missiles. It's not as good as what a lot of other factions have. But you're just happy to have the strategic flexibility. In multiplayer, this means that every now and then you can pull off that artillery spread army comp that completely throws your enemy off guard, and maybe they're not prepared for it. In campaign, because you can, if you play campaign like I play campaign, where I have a lot of different armies to kind of keep the campaign fresh and from it getting too stale, it's nice to be able to have this option to have like an artillery spread comp. Just kind of fun to change it up. The rock lobber is not that great. It's not very accurate, but it will still force your opponent to march to you. It will still probably get like 100 plus kills a lot of the time, just by the nature of artillery. The AI in particular is not that great at shutting these guys down. You just have to make sure you leave a unit or two to defend them. And it just gives you that additional strategic element. So I'm kind of inclined to put it in below average. Because it's not like this thing can't rack up 100 kills. It generally will. Well, I don't know. It's definitely not as good as mortar and stuff. I know Azag starts off with it, and like your first few battles, like this thing does tons of work, but I don't think it's good at all, I guess. I think that's very specific to like the start of the campaign. I put it there. It doesn't ultimately kill enough to kind of justify it most of the time. It gets outscaled really, really quickly. The Hammer of Gork applies a blinded debuff, which is really interesting. It's cool that there's an artillery piece. There's a couple others in the game too, obviously, but it's really cool artillery pieces that apply debuffs. It's like a supportive piece, which would be way cooler if it was more accurate, I gotta say. It's like, because like the front lines engage, right, and you think that this thing is going to be, helping your infantry, essentially win those trades, or even like on the flanks, maybe there's like a calf fight going on, or whatever the case might be. But it's just so unreliable. It's too bad it's on this unit and not on the Doom Diver. I'm inclined to put it here. It's ultimately more interesting, but I don't know. Maybe this is one of the few units that I haven't had like tons and tons of battles on. I've put in thousands of hours into this game. I've kind of no-lifed this game pretty much the last winter and the last. But yeah, I think maybe I'll test it out more, but it's just these units just aren't that great, unfortunately. Even though they give you that strategic element, you have to say they're on the weak side. Now, the Doom Diver Catapult. If you're going to do an artillery spread, either in multiplayer or in campaign, it's going to be this guy. It's not the greatest artillery in the world. So what a lot of people would say is, well, cannons are better at killing large units than Doom Divers are. Sure. Well, mortars are better at killing infantry than Doom Divers are. Sure. But the Doom Diver is a good go-between that is pretty good at both of those things. And the Greenskins don't have all these special, it's not like Empire where you got like 8 artillery pieces, or like Dwarves, where you can have like these hyper-specialized artillery sets. No, it's one catch-all. And that being said, it's accurate enough that it's going to hit single entities most of the time. Heck, I've even seen these things hit things in the air, which is fantastic. And it has enough of an explosion radius that it will wear down infantry as well. Like, it'll still rack up hundreds of kills if you're just focusing infantry all game. So, it's a great go-between, and I kind of like the idea of it not being like it's being good at everything, but not the best at everything. And this opens up a very, important strategic avenue for the Greenskins is that they can actually run artillery spread builds in campaign and multiplayer, like triple Doom Diver with the defenses and the support to actually do like an artillery shootout is really cool. Um, the more play styles a faction has, the less stale the campaign gets, right? Because the more different styles of armies you can have. And the Doom Divers are good. The Doom Divers are even great. And I'm going to put them at above average. I can't put them any higher than that because, they are outclassed by a lot of different artillery pieces from other factions. But ultimately, I just think it's a fantastic. I think it adds a lot to the roster. I really do. And I think it's above average. The Giant. Now everyone says the Giant is terrible, and it kind of is. The thing about the Giant is, so you have this massive HP pool. You do absurd amounts of weapon damage. Like the stats are kind of eye popping, and you're like, wow, this thing's crazy. But then the fact it has low armor and it's going to. Missiles just tend to not miss this thing. Like, if you have goblins fire a volley into this guy, he's probably going to take 100 out of 120 arrows, right? Like, he is going to take a stupidly high percentage of missile fire, and that's why even cheap missiles take this guy down with ease, because he doesn't have the armor anyways. Like 3 groups of goblin archers will take this guy down relatively quickly, within, 5 volleys or so each. So, I get why a lot of people are down on it, but let's think a bit strategically about this. Its primary weakness is against missile fire, right? Well, what if the army comp has no missiles? Well, then this guy all of a sudden becomes potentially a really powerful piece in the army. Like, I think a lot of people just write him off because of the failures with it, but they don't realize he does have strategic applications. Like in multiplayer, for instance, like double giant into vampire counts was a pretty good thing for the longest time, and now the Greenskins have more options, but it's still a powerful tech if you want to focus on that. And if you know that you're gonna push into Sylvania or something on the campaign map, maybe you should have a couple of giants in there. The high leadership means that they're not gonna be terror routed, until pretty late. They do absurd amounts of damage in melee. The vampire counts are essentially forced to. Their best line of action is to cycle charge with Blood Knights, but you're gonna have other stuff going on. Like, it's not gonna be that simple. They can't spirit leech it down because it has absurd amounts of HP. So the giant does have applications. I'm still gonna put it in the weak because it's just too vulnerable to missiles for consistency's sake. But I hope a lot of these other things are just generically weak, like the squigs and the artillery pieces. But the giant could potentially be very strong if used strategically. I just want you to know that. Okay, so now we have the 2 endgame single entities and their regiment of renown. Where's the other? Yeah, there he is. Now for multiplayer, these guys take a step down because large single entities are a bit of a liability in multiplayer. If your opponent brings the appropriate counters, they can get mad value. That's essentially what most of the arguments kind of revolve around. But in campaign, your end game units are kind of the kings, right? And these are no exception. Ultimately, this is sort of supposed to represent sort of the campaign strength, I think. So these guys are going to be really high. The Regiment of Renown Spider. So the Ragnarok Spider, let's just talk about it for a second. You might look at it and think, for a single entity, the stats really aren't that great. And they're not. But what it does have is it has really high armor and poison. So what you want to do with this guy, let's say you're facing another giant or whatever, or or Chimerian War Sphinx or whatever. You want to get this guy on those single entities, applying that poison and tanking a lot of damage. I think actually no, it has 120 armor, I think, but it's a really tanky poison dealer. So it's going to help hold that monster like a duel, and then you surround it with other things like Biggins or Boar Boy Biggins, or anything else. Basically, it's sort of like an extension of your Spider Riders. Obviously, not as versatile, because it's a slow single entity, but it's kind of used in the same way, a supportive thing, and it still does do good damage. Like, it's still gonna be taking chunks out of the enemy. It probably won't win most 1v1s, essentially. And it even has some missile fire too, kind of innate, from time. There's a couple of missile units on it too. It just gives it a little bit extra versatility. Still a phenomenal unit. I usually have 1 or 2 of these guys in my in-game armies, just because it's really nice to stick them on the single entities and either deal with them in a little bit, slowing down their damage with poison, or just like immediately crumpling them by getting a good surround and stuff. Really good unit. And the Regiment of Renown has spider hatchling summons, which just gives it more utility, really. I think these units are very good. I think I'm going to put them in strong with the Regiment of Renowns going here. And these guys, missile resistance, they get physical resistance when you research the technology, so you're stacking resistances. Insane HP pools, deal tons of damage to infantry. These are your infantry killer single entities where you want your spiders to kind of be dueling large entities. And honestly, I gotta do the same thing, I think. They're just extremely expensive and ultimately a bit overkill, but very, very powerful. The Regiment of Renown has a artillery attack to it, which just gives it, more versatility, kind of like the summons. It's kind of like the same deal, but you only get one of these guys. All right, I kind of wanted to do heroes and lords at the end, because in case we were talking about units, you kind of understand where everything falls. I really like how this is shaping up. Let's see here. Goblin Big Boss, River Troll Hag, Black Orc Big Boss, this is the Orc Shaman. I want to make sure I get this right. I think this is the Great Shaman, that's the Night Boss, and this is the Goblin Shaman. Okay. So you have 2 big bosses, and you have Death Magic, Little Wah, Big Wah. Okay. Where should I start? I'll do the magic first. Now, normally I don't like Death Magic that much, because Death Magic has 3 main uses. You have Soul Blight, which is a standalone, really good debuff AoE spell. You have a bunch of damaging spells, which are consistent because several of them are direct damage, but ultimately they don't do as much damage as most of the other lords in the game. I think it's kind of a misconception that Death Magic is like a high damage lore. It's a relatively low damage lore, actually. And then it has the Terrorite applications, right? The one that grants fear, and the AoE leadership bomb. So it has the terror routing attack to it. Generally speaking, I'm a bit down on the Lore of Death. The only thing that I think it does especially well is the terror routing. And that's my favorite thing because of that fact. But everything, I don't think the debuffs or the damage is as good as many other lores. So you might think, well, the River Troll Hag is probably somewhat down. But the River Troll Hag has a bunch of other utility on top of it being Lore of Death, because it's relatively tanky with regeneration, which means you can overcast. That's especially what it means. It's not that great in melee, but if you take a couple of punishing overcasts and do a bunch of damage, you'll actually regen that up. It has Mither, which is a powerful hex. That's off the Winds of Magic. It's just a regular ability. That's fantastic. It has, like, leadership buffs. You can have, like, its leadership aura boosted. It's really just kind of a great utility pick. Oh, it also has the stinky aura too, which kind of makes these guys even more irrelevant, but that's besides the point. So it has just more tools than both of these lures, but these lures of magic are better than Lure of Death in my opinion. So it's kind of the Greenskin Lords are really competitive, I gotta say. I think in multiplayer, just this offers too much. So obviously that does take the cake. But in campaign, it's a relatively tight call. Big Wah is your primary buff magic for the most part. Here We Go is a very strong AoE melee attack bonus that you're going to want to plop down when the front line engages their front line. And it just offers absurd amounts of bonus stats, really complementing the high weapon damage that orcs have. Fist of Gork is really good on one unit or like one group of units or whatever. Again, really good if you want your cav to actually win a fight, or like you have a single entity war between a Ragnarok spider and something else, you know, or like you have like a hero fight or a lord fight. It's a really good buff for those kinds of situations, and it just has really good damaging spells. Foot of Gork, very very strong, obviously high damage, high big AoE. Brainbuster, really really quick, really honestly hard to miss. You after your first couple of times, you'll probably get it. So just a very tight, good damage spell. It's just a very powerful lore. Probably the most powerful lore, at least in campaign. The Little Wah has a bunch of buffs and debuffs. Well, one buff, Sneaky Stabbing, which is a good little bonus to overall damage output. I don't think it's as good as Fists of Gork, but that's okay. It's very cheap. You also have just tons of various debuffs, and it has a spell that gives stall. Like it's just almost like off the top of my head, maybe there's a couple of lores that are just as good utility wise, but it might just be the best utility lore magic in the entire game, just for all the different tools that it has. Very very solid. Not quite the raw power of the Big Wah, but because there's so many little things, if used well, it probably is on par, to be honest. So where would I rank these in the campaign? I still think the Big Wah is my go-to for campaign specifically, so I have to put the Orc Shaman in S. I just think it's that good. A lot of my strategies have been developed with this lore over the years, so I really know how to use it well. And the Little Wah as much. I mean, Death Magic is pretty brain dead. You can't really mess that up. You know what spells you want to do, whether you want to damage or you want to tear her out, really. I just don't really like it that much. But the Troll Hag it offers just so much utility. Outside the Lure of Death, I think I gotta put it in strong tier. Oh man, this is tough. The Goblin Hero itself is, well, I guess the Orc Shaman too. I guess they don't really have much else going for them, do they? It's really just their lore. I think I would do... I might actually bring her lower a little bit, which is probably surprising to a lot of people. I just don't like Lure of Death that much. If you like Lure of Death more, she'll probably be higher. She does have a lot more utility, but the Lure of Death really drags it down for me. And I actually stopped putting her in some of my more favorite endgame armies, but she's obviously very, very endgame worthy, clearly, but that might just be a personal preference for me. And then as we have our two big bosses, this one's pretty self-explanatory, really. The Goblin Big Boss is not... He's sort of like half a hero, right? Like, he doesn't have as good stats, he doesn't have as good utility, he's actually has half the upkeep cost. He's 125 instead of 250. And what this makes him is like the greatest field hero. Maybe not the greatest field hero in the game, but an exceptional campaign hero on the campaign map because of how cheap he is and what he provides. He still has Assassinate, He actually has a skill that gives him bonus campaign vision, which is fantastic. You know, it's great to have a bunch of these guys kind of running around. You can have control. You can have full vision of your neighbors, which, by the way, is a very important thing to do in campaign, to have really good vision control, essentially, for much cheaper than what most other factions can do. So, because of that, he's going to be a lot higher. That being said, he's clearly the worst hero, like, for his slot in an army, but that's not really what he's, best at. So, I'd probably put him. It's hard to rate that, but I'd probably put him. Actually, I think I will just put him average. Because, I mean, by the end of the day, it's just his a lot of his strength comes from the fact that he is cheaper and does a lot of the same stuff on the campaign map. So is it really that crazy? I guess it's not, but it's cool that he's in the game. It's really cool that you have this 125 upkeep hero. I just gotta say. And the Black Orc Big Boss, probably S for campaign especially. He's been nerfed in multiplayer, and I know he's had some price increases, which he's probably not S there anymore. In fact, he's probably more in the middle of the pack because he's kind of pricey. But in campaign, man, this guy really pays for us. He's just such a phenomenal thing in the army. Absurdly high combat stats, like all heroes, can be augmented by equipment. Incredible skills, like the one you want in your army is probably the Vigor Reduction for orc units, for like an orc, endgame army. But, he's also great on the campaign map. You can do one orc army, which gives you bonuses to a lot of your campaign skills. One of the best combat heroes in the entire game. I mean, just an absolute beast of a unit, I gotta say. And I haven't been able to justify taking him out in like any case in the end game in my main armies. All right, almost done. On to the lords. We'll do the 3 generic ones first. So the Orc Chieftain is a lord for being a lord's sake, and clearly weaker. Offers less than anything else here. Even the goblin heroes have much more utility than this guy has for multiple reasons, which I'll get into. And I gotta put this guy in F tier, honestly, both in multiplayer and in campaign. Like, he is just straight up, just there's nothing that he doesn't offer anything that makes you want to go into him. You know what I'm saying? Which is kind of unfortunate. He should at least get like some personal skill to like orcs or something, just something real minor. Because he's just terrible. He really is. Now, the 2 goblins are your main lords that you're going to be doing for your economy armies, because they have, additional goblin buffs that the Orc Chieftain does not have, like Goblin Tide, and he has something similar to Goblin Tide, but instead of armor, it gives charge bonus to the goblins and melee attack to all goblins. But something similar. The Goblin Shaman comes with a little wasp, so he has that whole utility package that I was talking about. The Night Goblin Boss comes with Fermented Fungi, which is a very powerful CC rampage effect, as well as, another ability off the top of my head. I can't remember it. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired. And the Goblin Great Shaman has the single damage ability that increases recharge rate as well. Like, they're just packed with like tools. In addition to having more buffs to goblins, because you probably want your legendary lords commanding your endgame armies, right? Most people would, in theory, just because they're stronger lords. So that leaves these more generic lords to want to buff your economy armies. Well, goblins are clearly the best option for economy armies. You can have a ton of combat strength for just 800 to 1,000 gold. So that already makes these guys more of a niche than him. And then on top of that, they have all this crazy utility. Like, you know, the thing that this guy has over, like, say, the Goblin Great Shaman is he has a combat tree. But, like, who cares? I mean, he's clearly worse. And he doesn't have anything... Oh, that's Grimgore. I'm sorry. I meant the regular Goblin Chieftain. They're just so much better than him because they facilitate what you want, and they have just more buffs and debuffs and stuff. So they're clearly better. Now, a lot of people, the night boss has like some ambush bonuses to him as well. Like I know he has a skill that increases ambush chance and melee attack during ambushes. But to me, the little Wah is just more utility. It's just stronger. For me personally, it's even stronger than having like Skarsnik Cess Juice, for example. He has the Ragnarok mount, which is really, really strong. Generally speaking, I think Goblin Tide is stronger than the Night Boss's Goblin Tide variant skill. So I would definitely put him at much higher than the Night Goblin War Boss, but I still think he's a really good lord. I'd put him in average, to be honest. Great for your economy armies. But in my opinion, outclassed by the Goblin Great Shaman, who I'm going to put in strong. I think he's a great lord. My go-to for all my secondary armies. Even for orc-based armies. You would think the Orc Chieftain would be better for orcs. Nah, I'd rather have magic than just, like, a combat lord. That's really not that great at combat. Like, he'll eventually be decent, but... yeah. Oh, finally we got the 5 legendary lords. Grimgore is your 1v1 duelist. Really good at killing footlords and heroes. But he has the weaknesses that footlords have, where he has a hard time getting around the battlefield efficiently. You know, he essentially is just like a massive stat stick, can get kited out pretty easily. Grom is sort of similar to Grimgore, but he is on a chariot, and he is like an infantry killer. Just tends to rack up hundreds upon hundreds of kills. A very, very tanky with regeneration, which is pretty fantastic. Grimgore's personal line has a lot of buffs to like Black Orcs, that kind of thing. Grom's has a lot of buffs to Goblins. Grom can actually make an endgame army of Goblins and like a true endgame army, something that'll just wipe the entire map if you really wanted to, which is kind of cool, but he still probably has the worst Doom stack of the 5, just because, yeah, he does make Goblins OP in a sense, but they will still lose to other legendary lords with more OP units with the augmentation. Like, you got to think of him versus these other guys in ideal situations, right? Like, think player versus player. It's ultimately still the weakest Doom stack, but it is still a Doom stack that can still clear the map. Skarsnik is kind of the night boss. Similar, he's just ultimately a little bit stronger. Just because he has, you know, more skills and stuff going on. He's also a little bit tankier because he's got the squig guy as well. You know, and the legendary items and all that kind of stuff that goes with them. So he's just a more powerful version of this. Very potent in multiplayer because of that fermented fungi especially. But kind of fallen off for me on the campaign. Just because, again, I really like the Goblin Great Shaman. Azhag is your flying lord because he has the Wyvern mount. He has the Lure of Death, which I've already talked about, kind of low on my list. He's a hybrid lord where he can do combat like Grimgore, and he can do death magic, which is cool, but man, it's a really heavy constraint on where to allocate your points because you can't do both the blue tree and the red tree and magic and combat and get like his personal line done. Like, you're just going to run out of things to spend it on. So he's never going to be as good in combat as Grimgore. He's never going to be good in combat as Wurzag in magic. So to me, Azag's really cool and unique, but I just don't like him that much. I'm gonna put him below average, even below the. I like him less than the night boss, to be honest. My favorite way to play him is to just don't do the blue or the red tree until like really late. Maybe like splash a few points into it. Just go hard into combat and hard into magic, and he can like go in. He can basically be the perfect hybrid, but because he's not boosting his units as well, as much, at least in the red tree. I know he has items that do that. He just ultimately just has always felt weaker in the end game. I can never get his end game stack to be as strong as some of the others, and I just don't really like Lord of Death that much. And then Wurzag is your ultimate Big Wah caster. Has the Bone Will staff, which essentially is every time you cast a spell, you get like a mini Wah effect. He can cast Foot of Gork for stupidly low winds of magic. He can essentially clear most armies himself, essentially, by kiting and just casting Big Wah. Stupid campaign buffs. Easily what I think is the greatest Greenskin Lord. I love casters. I love how his entire kit has essentially perfect synergy with the roster and the playstyle. I gotta put him on S. He's probably a bit lower in multiplayer now because Grom is so strong in multiplayer, but in campaign, I gotta give it to Grom. Skarsnik, again, I said it was the night boss, but slightly stronger. I'll put him here. Grimgor and Grom. This is a tough one. I mean, they're clearly incredible combat lords. I think that their buffs to their faction, though, aren't that amazing. I'm trying to separate Grom from his Cauldron, because I know the Cauldron is stupid strong, but I'm trying to look at Grom with just him, his items, and his skills to try and, like, I feel like giving him his faction effect of the Cauldron is a bit unfair to the other guys because they don't have an OP faction mechanic like that. He does ultimately have the strongest goblin stack in the game. I think I'm going to put him here. Yeah. And then we have Grimgor, who... again, the greatest duelist on the Greenskin roster. Buffs Black Orcs, which I kind of wish the buffs were, in other places, I guess. Like, do they really need buffs? Not really. And he could just have a hard time contributing as much because he's a Footlord. I'll put him in above average, though. He does get stupidly strong combat stats and weapon strength. So that is sort of the relative power level of all the Greenskin units in comparison with each other. I really think this list ended up becoming pretty accurate. There's some personal bias in here, but I've played with these units quite a bit. I mean, there's always going to be personal bias. Maybe you've had more success with some of these lower ones, or not as much success with some of these higher ones, but and hopefully this kind of helps you formulate your strategies. I do plan on doing like an army comp guide, maybe, where I talk about like a dozen or so skill allocations and like army comps and how to execute them on the battlefield. And then also I want to do maybe like a formations guide too, just kind of a bit more hands-on, maybe a little bit of gameplay in there. This is my first video ever, so it might not be the highest quality. It's just, if anything, it's just me sort of having fun and getting some of my thoughts out there, but hopefully you found it enjoyable. I hope that I was clear and concise and not rambled too much, but anyway, I won't keep you. Thank you very much for watching the video and sharing this experience with me, and I hope you have a successful Greenskin campaign. Thank you very much. See ya.